Few matters of housekeeping before we get started. There are a lot of people here, and I know why. But if everyone can just try to keep side conversations to an absolute minimum, keep movements to a minimum, that would really help us out. Well, good evening and welcome. Good evening and welcome. We are so delighted to have you joining us tonight. We are at the caffeine capital of COP, as I understand. If you haven't had the coffee yet, definitely try it out tomorrow. My name is Brian O'Callaghan. I'm here with multiple capacities, but principally as a member of the Minderoo Lethal Humidity Global Council, and also I'm at the University of Oxford, where I lead a program on sustainable government and investment. So we're here tonight to do what Australia does best, which is punch above its weight and drink some good booze. Usually, sometimes we do those things in parallel. Tonight, they're a bit sequential, so bear with us. We wanted to open tonight by posing a question. That is, what would it mean for Australia to host an ambitious COP31? As everyone knows, thank you very much. Australia is very much focused on winning that bid, and if we are to, we want to ensure that it is ambitious. So to unpack that question, we are joined by three of the Pacific's most inspiring voices, representing business, diplomacy, and civil society. We're most grateful to the Minderoo Foundation for convening this event tonight, especially in the context of its global work on climate change. We're grateful to all of you for being here. We're grateful in particular to His Excellency, Mr. Surangal S. Whips, Jr., who is the president of Palau. Thank you, sir, for joining us. It's a real honor. So, for those who may not be familiar, the Minderoo Foundation is one of Australia's largest philanthropic organizations. It was founded by Dr. Andrew Forrest and Nicola Forrest, with a dedication to tackle some of the world's most challenging topics, to fight the world's fight. Its mission is to forge a fair future where people and natural ecosystems thrive together. So with Dr. Forrest here tonight, I want to acknowledge his leadership and commitment to make all of this happen. It enables Minderoo to tackle some of those big challenges. So with Minderoo's support, we're focusing tonight on the devastating effects of climate change, which has been at the focus, the heart of the Foundation's work for many years. I've seen personally the work of Minderoo on this topic through the Lethal Humidity Global Council, which looks at the effects of climate change on real communities, real people now, under the combined impacts of heat and humidity, and perhaps we'll hear a bit more about that through the proceedings. I've also been consistently inspired by Minderoo's ambition and ability to walk the talk at the gnarly intersections between climate and other global problems. For example, climate and modern slavery, climate and so many of the issues that are most affecting us today. So with that context, friends, let us turn our attention to the key question for the evening, which is, what would it mean for Australia to host an ambitious COP? For that, as you all know, here in Baku, we're looking to COP31, so 2 years from now. And we're focusing on a definition of ambition that includes hearing, listening to, and actually understanding what our Pacific partners believe and have to say, and also focusing on the accelerated phase out of fossil fuels. Dr. Forrest's own company, Fortescue, sees ambition in the same way. Fortescue, which most of you will know, is a global green technology, energy and minerals group, has shown that committing to real zero, not net zero, real zero, is possible. It's hard, but it's possible, and it's essential. I'm about to invite Dr. Forrest to the stage. He doesn't need an introduction, but allow me to provide one with a little bit of a personal spin. Dr. Andrew Forrest is executive chairman and founder of Fortescue, Minderoo Foundation, and Tatarang. He is one of the most outspoken leaders on climate change in the world. I'm quite genuine when I say that. And he matches his ambition with action, which is frankly another rarity. He sees problems in the world, he feels those problems, and with the apparatus around him, he acts on those problems. And what I've seen personally is that this isn't from an ivory tower, it's at the front lines. While his contemporaries are, lazing on beach chairs in Miami, I've met with him in Kenya just after he spent time looking at green ammonia sites there. While his contemporaries are naming buildings after themselves, he is here. He is meeting with folks in Brazil, meeting with folks in Morocco, meeting with folks around the world to make something happen. And to put it into the context of COP, there are a bunch of leaders who show up here and don't step foot in the blue zone. They're occupied with their own ivory tower discussions off-site. Yet Andrew is here. I've literally been in conversations with him with the Least Developed Countries Group, asking, what can I do to help you make your ambitions happen? And that's really, frankly, different. So friends, join me in welcoming Dr. Forrest to the stage.
Look, it is actually my honour to be here. I'm very grateful that you've shown up. I'm sure it's not the wine. I'm sure it's not the hospitality. I'm sure it's because you're just passionate to be here, and also because I have entrusted the President of Palau to be the holdout vote if this COP tries to roll back what was achieved at great pain last year. And I've been asked half a dozen times by half a dozen journalists, what are you here for, Dr. Forrest? All your other fellow business leaders and others, notables, didn't come. I said, well, I'm clearly here to cut oil and gas deals. That's what you do in COPs. And then the phone goes or the TV goes silent for a bit. And you say, I'm just joking, mate. But this is a really interesting COP because they're going to have a crack at rolling it back. Now, the beauty of getting the job done last year is that it had to be unanimous. Rolling it back has got to be unanimous. We've got a president with proper chutzpah here who will be one who I'm going to say, you'll be offered treasure chests of gold and threats of everything. Hold the line. For everyone in Palau, hold the line for the other 8 billion people who aren't swanning around, burning oil and gas and just making up excuses with this Net Zero 2050. I have to say, Net Zero 2050 clearly, ladies and gentlemen, isn't working. And this is why I'm so delighted the Minderoo Foundation is leaning hard forward to educate the world that eliminating fossil fuel from a scientific perspective is absolutely urgent by 2040. It is like your last chance corral, humanity. Get rid of it by 2040 or your global emissions will continue to rise for decades after, even if you are successful in net at 2050. 2080, you're still going to be having rising global emissions because net does nothing. If you go real zero, which is simply stopping burning fossil fuel, Minderoo is doing the work here, it's doing the research, it's done the science. Stopping burning fossil fuel beats the big gorilla in the room, everything else which is conflated, agricultural emissions. It's an issue. You make fossil fuel green, you're going to take everything else with you. You make energy in our planet green, you'll take everything else with you. Keeping it in there and not focusing on fossil fuel suits fossil fuel. Because you're hearing this word, well, unfortunately, you're going to have to give up eating. I'm sorry, no more food. No more food, we're going net zero 2050, agricultural emissions. Oh, well, we're not going to stop eating, sir, so therefore we're going to keep burning fossil fuel. That's the message. It's a dangerous conflation. So let's scrape that away. Say, actually, all we need is something bankable, financeable. Remember, this is the COP of finance. Now, net zero 2050 is financed nothing. You've got 2009 a call for $100 billion by the developing world, which is now up to $1 trillion. Those big numbers, 2009 for $100 billion, I can assure you if you're around then, was just impossible. $1 trillion was just impossible. No one's going to pony up a loss to their economy to give other countries which aren't going to vote them into office at the next election that kind of capital. But I want to share with you that capital is completely and utterly available. It's called a good investment. Any amount of capital will follow a good investment. There's trillions and trillions of dollars today looking for good investments. Real Zero 2040, quite simply, is a good investment. And I just want to give you an example. If building out the plant and apparatus you need to replace your fossil fuel consumption costs you X, like let's say in our case 6.2 billion at Fortescue, and you save 1 billion litres of diesel a year, which in our case at Fortescue by 2030 will be $1 billion a year, then you've got a 15% rate of return, which is somewhat above Warren Buffett's miracle of 9%. That's a really good investment. We, before we embarked on this investment, compared if we wanted to replace all that billion litres of diesel with just making it ourselves, integrating ourselves vertically integrated into fossil fuel, what would it cost us? Many know that Western Australia is the largest gas producer in the world. We buy a gas field, we put in the gasification, the liquefaction plants, we bring in all the pipelines, we do all that, 15 to 20 year approvals, then you can start building. We'd be lucky to be done by 2050. Instead, not that capital, but 6.2 billion, and we'll be done by 2030. And it's a great investment. My simple message here is to the bankers of the world: find those projects and companies which are going to stick with fossil fuel and could have transferred to renewable, and sell them, short them, and put the capital into those companies which are going to eliminate fossil fuel, lower their cost of production, return that value to shareholders, give a return to investors. You will raise that $1 trillion around the world simply because it's a good investment. So the Minderoo Foundation and Fortescue calls for this COP to start the ball rolling. If we are the finance COP, then let's stop talking jargon, let's talk dollars, let's talk reality, let's talk measurable. If you want measurable, if you want your loans repaid, if you want a good investment, we're going Real Zero 2040, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we have to achieve. And Mr. President, don't let this COP start by rolling back last year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Forrest. Unfortunately, Dr. Forrest is, I understand, quadruple booked this evening. Thank you for giving just a few moments of your time tonight. Now, before we move on to our panel, I've been asked to provide a few context-setting remarks, again, around this question of what does ambition look like in the context of COP31. Look, the Pacific knows firsthand, absolutely firsthand, the cost of inaction on climate change. Feels it every single day. Communities face rising seas, more intense storms, threats to food security. These aren't future risks. These are now risks. These are today risks, and not just risks, realities. Australia, on the other hand, I mean, not necessarily on the other hand, we face those same risks, but additionally, we're uniquely positioned to lead a global transition. Some of our companies, the one just aforementioned, are doing that already. And frankly, we have a bloody lot to gain from doing it. As Andrew often says, Fortescue has returned the highest shareholder returns of any company in history from its founding. We've long relied on fossil fuels, but there's a real opportunity here to shift towards sustainable energy solutions, sustainable economy solutions. Investing in sustainable transport over traditional transport, we know, academically demonstrated, delivers higher economic multipliers, delivers more jobs. So there's economic opportunity. Economic opportunity, economic resilience, economic security. And what does that all translate to? Prosperity. Yet, we have to be clear-eyed with what's required. Tackling climate change at its source means the rapid, just transition from fossil fuels, and that's the urgent challenge that we're facing. Now, addressing that challenge is something we ought not do on our own or attempt to do on our own. It demands genuine collaboration, in particular with our Pacific neighbors. Together, we must prioritize the levers critical for reducing fossil fuel reliance, and we must be ready to elevate the voices that matter most. The Pacific isn't just a region that's impacted by climate change, it's a powerful witness and a partner in the fight. And so again, we must listen, we must learn, we must internalize the wisdom that is available to be shared. We've talked about the economic prosperity opportunity for Australia, but that can be true for the Pacific as well. A brief personal recount. I lived and worked in the Solomon Islands for a while, and the Solomon Islands at the time was almost 100% dependent on fossil fuels, not just coal or gas, diesel. They burned diesel for electricity. That meant that their economy faced some of the highest electricity costs in the world, I think second highest in the world. The local family I lived with at the time, for them it was literally a daily decision. Are we going to have a more lavish lunch, or are we going to pay for our electricity? Because in that context, you prepay for electricity. And that single example is just to say that moving towards greener initiatives, greener opportunities, it's not just about meeting environmental goals, it's about unlocking economic opportunities. We know green technologies are far cheaper in a context like that. And listening to our Pacific neighbors also means focusing on justice. I mean that in terms of both communities and workers that are downstream, that feel the benefits, but also those that are upstream. And that's where human rights, for example, come into the picture. Folks, there is no point in saving our planet if it means losing our humanity. I'll say that again. There's no point saving our planet if we lose our humanity. So it's unacceptable to accept climate progress with our eyes closed to the exploitation that consumption might risk. So we can't accept the cognitive dissonance that is exploiting the most vulnerable in order to save the most vulnerable. Those two things don't work. And therefore, we need to partner with those who are most vulnerable, those who are our witnesses here. So in the lead up to COP31, Minderoo is proposing a roadmap: build policy alignment, foster international support, and strengthen regional cooperation. And as we explore that roadmap further, I'm delighted to introduce our two additional panelists this evening. The first, and please come up as I introduce you, is Her Excellency Alana Seed, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Palau to the United Nations, and incoming chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. Ambassador Seed currently serves as the permanent representative, and she's also the Sherpa co-chair of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. Alongside her role at the UN, she has been the non-resident ambassador of Palau to Israel since 2022 and co-chairs the steering committee of the Blue Economy and Finance Forum. She has a professional background that brings a lot to the table here, including founding and leading SundayMorning.com, which is a New York-based venture. Also delighted to introduce Caroline Kitione from the Shifting the Power Coalition. Carolyn is the Shifting the Power Coalition's interim regional representative and has been actively engaged in the Pacific women's movement using community media tools, locally led innovation, and more to forge real partnerships across local communities, as well as in regional civil society and government processes. Her work with the coalition puts her in the center of the efforts to drive an inclusive peace, development, humanitarian nexus. You're noticing a theme in the presentations. As the regional representative, she convenes the 12 women-led organizations of the Shifting the Power Coalition to promote Pacific, women-led climate and humanitarian action. So I'm going to transition to this chair in a second. As I do that, Karen, we're going to start with you with a broad question. You know, you live and work on the front lines of climate change in Fiji. You've experienced firsthand the destruction of intensifying cyclones and storms. You've seen the slow onset impacts of climate change too, including prolonged droughts and more. Some of us will know that the Shifting the Power Coalition's work represents more than 100,000 women across 6 Pacific Island countries. So perhaps as we start this panel, could you introduce us a little bit more to the vision mission of Shifting the Power Coalition? And then perhaps what you're seeing and hearing from community leaders now.
Okay, thank you. And I'm very pleased to be here. You will forgive me if my voice shakes, my hand shakes. I am determined to ensure that my resolve to sit still in this chair does not shake. Just to give a bit of background before I respond to the question, the coalition really came together and the idea was to transform the humanitarian architecture at the time. And so we really wanted to make sure that, you know, as we work within the gender and climate change spaces, when we're talking about leave no one behind, we had to look around the tables that we were already at and see who was not there. And so our founding vision was to bring together women leaders from different networks. We were intentional in working with young women because young women have their own ideas about how they want to advocate for the priorities that they have. We wanted to bring together women with disability because even within civil society, we see women with disability as beneficiaries of our actions rather than as autonomous people with their own solutions to the challenges that they face. We also wanted to make sure that as we were working with young women, there was also the intention of working with older women as well. Because we recognize that if we want to keep movements and solutions sustainable, we have to understand where the movement has come from. And so that approach to intergenerational spaces and conversations was very important to the women leaders who came together to form the Shifting the Power Coalition. But as I said, we also came out of some very devastating disasters when the 12 partners came together. We had just experienced Tropical Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu in 2015. And then not long after that, we experienced Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji, both Category 5 cyclones. But I'm going to be honest, by the time Tropical Cyclone Winston hit Fiji, there were many of us who still did not understand, even while we were preparing for the cyclone, what a Tropical 5 cyclone could look like. We saw the devastation in Vanuatu, and we tried our best to respond and prepare as well as we could, but we just didn't have the time or the capacity to understand what it would actually mean if it made landfall in Fiji. And so in coming together since 2016, the last 8 years have really been an opportunity for us to understand what the priorities are for women within the humanitarian space. We know prior to 2016 to 2015 that women and girls were disproportionately affected by disasters. That was known 10, 15, 20 years ago. There are enough studies to prove that point. And yet, even 8 years on, we're still hearing the same narrative. What we are not hearing enough of is the fact that women leaders in their communities have actually been responding to the disasters in their own ways. And that needs to be celebrated and amplified. And as a coalition, we've been working with our partners to amplify women-led innovation in Pacific communities. Because we also have to recognize that even though we live in the same country, some of us still come from urban areas who have no experience with the kind of impacts that our rural families are facing. We all face climate change. Yes, that will never be disputed. But the impact on each of us is very different. And so we've had to recognize that in order for us to genuinely not leave anyone behind, we've had to look around at the circle within the coalition to see what the priorities are from women who come from coastal communities, because their priorities and the impact that they face are going to be very different to women who come from highland communities. We don't face the impact the same way. And so over the last few years, in the 8 years that we've organized as a coalition, it's really been about ensuring that there is an intersectional approach to the way that we try to transform that humanitarian architecture, but at the same time acknowledge that there is a need for capacity strengthening when we're trying to influence. Oh, is time up? No, that's just going to make me want to talk longer. Don't cut my mic. I'm going to talk longer now. Yes, so I'm back. The point I wanted to make is that it's always going to be important to have that intergenerational, but at the same time intersectional approaches. Because what we also learned coming out of tropical cyclones Winston and Pam is that when the humanitarian response teams went out to these communities, the priorities of the diverse women in those communities were not being addressed. Yes, there were cyclone kits given out, but what they did not have in those kits was sanitary kits for women. What they did not have were dignity packs for persons with disability, because apparently they don't seem to exist in rural communities. When you are not talking directly to people who are affected in those communities, you drop the ball on quite a few things, and every single person here knows that. Because we've either been part of the community that's been impacted, or we've been responsible for the decisions that's been made out there in those communities. Decisions where sometimes we don't have any business making because we don't belong to those communities. What we've also learned from working as a coalition and working with diverse Pacific Island women is that they've been the ones to make the linkages between climate change and other intersecting crises. SRHR, they've been responding to climate change by also addressing the risks to our biodiversity. They've actually been making the linkages between GBV, between gender-based violence and climate change. And those are not factors that we take into consideration when we're coming into spaces like this to talk about climate change. And so it's been a priority for us to amplify those voices, because our advocacy will continue. But I think for me, at the end of the day, it comes back to the allies who are listening to our stories, who are inviting us into spaces. And this is not me being personal here, but this is about wherever we take our stories. Because at some point, let me just say this before I make my point. At some point, it does get exhausting talking about our stories. And we can only keep talking about it so much until we start to get angry and ask you, what have you done with it? We can't keep asking the communities most affected to talk about the trauma that affects them, because this is generational trauma. This is trauma that we're not just managing personally, but trauma that we've had to address with our families, with our communities as well. And so as you're asking Pacific Islanders, as you're asking those from small island and developing states to talk about the trauma that climate change has had on them, you also must look at your own actions. How are you going to act in solidarity beyond this space? What is your solidarious action from here? And we can't keep sitting and listening. We have to act, but at the same time, not just hold our governments accountable, but hold each other accountable as well for what we do with these stories. Because these stories are evidence. They may not be documented in the way that you expect it to be documented, but the stories are out there for your evidence, for you to take into those negotiation spaces and really influence the decisions that need to be made by those who have made the decisions for us. So I also do want to just wrap up before I have to hand the mic over, that as Pacific Island women, we come from communities where we are also the primary stewards for agricultural practices. And it's not just about, and when we're thinking about how and what kind of food we're going to put on the table, it's not just us responding to issues of starvation and food poverty. It's also us responding to the economic, financial, and the health insecurities that this causes when we are unable to farm, when we have to go out further into the oceans to fish. And so these are intersecting crises that we've been responding to as a coalition with our partners. And we also recognize that as we take these stories out, we must give back to them also. And so we have a responsibility to ensure that we are doing an analysis of the conversations that we are having. And we are being very transparent and accountable about how we are going to do that. And so my final thought, actually I have another thought coming up, but I will end my 5 minutes here by saying that as you listen to the stories of your allies, of your network, of your partners, have a reflection of what your acts of solidarity are going to be beyond here. We know that negotiations are going to go not just beyond this next week and a half. It takes time. But you do need to look at your acts of solidarity and hold each other accountable to what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, and more importantly, who you're going to say it to and how you're going to say it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for the energy that it very clearly takes. We're really grateful for that. I think to summarize for the audience, are you going to be an ally? What are the allied actions that you're going to take? Are you going to hold people around you accountable for their allyship? Ambassador, we're going to move on to you now. Perhaps just as an opening question, I know from many forums I've seen you in before, that the extreme measures small island states have already been forced to take to respond to rising sea levels are very real, economically deleterious, socially, mentally, really challenging. What, in your view, are some of the lesser appreciated impacts of the existing and emerging threats, and what actions do you think are most critical for us to be taking in response to them, again with the view to 2 years down the line a potential COP in Australia?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to Minderoo for hosting us. Yes, I think drawing on some of Carolyn's comments, I think in the Pacific and in Palau, climate change is threats to climate change are very real, and they're happening now. In addition to sea level rise, we face increased storm typhoons, and they destroy infrastructure. We also have a food security risk. So the sea level rise impacts taro, which is a crop that we grow in Palau, and it impacts food security. We also see a lot of challenges with the ocean. So we have ocean acidification and coral bleaching. Palau is very well known for our coral reefs. We are a major scuba diving destination, similar to Australia, and we've seen coral bleaching events that are devastating our reefs, and they will have an impact on our tourism and economic revenues And all of these factors also compound to the economic implications as well. So all of that fiscal space that can go to health or education, that is now being diverted to all these climate effects. So when there's a storm comes in and there has to be restoration, money is diverted there. If we take out loans to solve for some of these climate things, they are also loans we'll have to pay back. So that's a particular case in the Caribbean. I think the statistic is that they pay 18 times more in debt payments than they get in climate finance. So it's very similar to a lot of Pacific islands, and we're seeing increased storm in frequency and strength. So we can predict that we'll see more of that. So what can we do? I think because climate is a real impact to the Pacific, the leadership in the Pacific Islands has been very real at the COP. So back during the negotiations for the Paris Agreement, the Pacific Island ministers were the ones who were towing the line for the 1.5 degree target. If there were no Pacific ministers that towed the line, there would not be a 1.5 degree target. So I think drawing from their leadership then, what can we do now? And I think this is my fourth COP now, and I've seen that the Pacific has continued to lead. A couple of years ago, we were successful in negotiating the Loss and Damage Fund. That was operationalized last year. And last year, we were also successful in getting the transition away from fossil fuels language into the document. That was a very difficult negotiation. AOSIS was kind of the last to agree. And I think going forward, that Pacific leadership is necessary and will be required. So one of the things that we're hoping to get at this COP is a very ambitious NCQG number. That will be a signal how much money is there, how much finance is there to allow countries to transition. Next year in Brazil, that will be an NDC COP. So given the number that we negotiate this year, it will allow us to then set targets for NDCs for all countries next year. And then hopefully, in 2 years' time, we then go into Australia. So some ideas that we are hoping we can socialize with the Australia if they can be successful in bidding for the COP is how do we accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels? We don't think that there can be, as Dr. Forrest said, that's kind of a key priority, I think should be a key priority for the world. But particularly in the Pacific where we have very fragile ecosystems like coral reefs, if we overshoot 1.5 degrees, I think it's over 90% of those coral reefs will die. And so that will be a very different lived reality for a lot of us. And so I think that's one of the goals that we, Palau will be the chair of AOSIS for the next 2 years. And I think we have our homework cut out for us, but we also understand based on the past that we can have a really powerful role in transforming the way this climate negotiation happens, and also that the way that the future we see it will roll out. So we're very excited to take on that role, to take on the leadership hopefully with Australia as the host of the COP, and really show some Pacific leadership to transform the planet for our future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Seed. You know, I opened this by saying that Australia is known for punching above its weight. I should amend that. The Pacific is known for punching above its weight. Thank you for sharing those examples with us. I think particularly pertinent for me is putting in context those economic consequences and the debt consequences. You said 18 times as much climate payments incoming climate payments are spent on outgoing debt payments. And I know the average for a small island developing states is, I think, almost 50% are spending more on interest than they are on education, and something like 70% are spending more on interest than they are on healthcare. So these are really challenging times to be in. So thank you for that. Carolyn, we might go back over to you. You provided a really helpful introduction to the coalition, as well as the various stories that are resonating in the Pacific, and particularly among Pacific Island women. we had an introduction from the ambassador as to some specific ideas for collaboration in advance of a Australia Pacific COP. Do you have further ideas to share there?
This thing is showing low battery, so I will speak before it actually goes off. Listen, we've been talking a lot about COP31, Australia, the Pacific, and it's great if it comes over to our region of the world, because then that means that everybody outside of it can take the 2-day flight that it took us to get here. It'll save us money to get to Australia, although y'all need to work on your visa processes. But and this is a question that's come up from a couple of members of the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, of which the coalition is a part of. Should Australia not get COP, what happens to the Pacific partnerships that you are trying to negotiate right now? What happens to us after that, after next week? You know, there's real concern because there's money coming into the Pacific from Australian partners who want to work with us, but those relationships are based on trust. And as Pacific Island women-led civil society organizations, we're really looking at how Australia itself is working with First Nations people. Your intentions there inform our relationship with you as well as civil society organizations. And that's always going to be a priority for Indigenous peoples everywhere. How you respond to the priorities of your Indigenous people, and really of any government, should inform the priorities that we have, because just transitions, and that's a conversation we've been having a lot this week, just transitions should be about people. You mentioned it in your opening, that it should be about human rights. And if we're going to be talking about just transitions, we also need to look at our current relationship with the different ecosystems as well. And in thinking about that Pacific COP, that Australia Pacific COP, you know, it's always going to be important to talk about climate financing, because it's about accessibility of those finance to community-based organizations who are on the front lines, not because we want to be, but because we have to be. We are responding to a crisis that was not our fault. And yet, we've been told that we are the ones who have to hold the line. Because if we don't, what happens next? And that's been a real concern with us as we look at COP negotiations. Say, where to from here? What happens to all these partnerships? And so if we're going to be talking about centering people and centering Indigenous knowledge in just transition spaces, because that is important when we look at our stewardship role with the different ecosystems, we must also look at the kind of partnerships and relationships and trust building that we need to have with our own Indigenous communities. And this isn't just for Australia, this is for everyone. We are all Indigenous to somewhere. And as I've learned from, there was a panel here with First Nations young women who really said that you can't move forward if you're not looking back at what's happened. And that's always going to be important for anyone who centers people in any movement. Climate change, peace building. If you're working within the disability network, center people, and then we can have a real conversation about what the priorities should be at the upcoming COP. Because for us, the priorities haven't changed. It's the kind of partnership building that needs to be looked at as we're moving into negotiations. And so as a Fijian young woman, I'm always going to stand in solidarity with other Indigenous people, Maori, Pacific Islanders, First Nations, about what the priorities are for us. And that's centering trust as we address the priorities of climate change, but also ensuring that there's an accessibility of resources for those who are on the front lines, who didn't need to be if people had already addressed the issues caused by industrial nations. That's what I want us to think about as we really push for Australia to host COP31. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. That is a genuine, real, significant challenge to all of us, I think, and I think it's one we shouldn't take lightly. It builds on allyship, as you described. Is that allyship based on expectation, or is it fundamental? That's important for everyone here in the room. It's also important for our leaders in the negotiations process. I know that Australia's lead negotiator was planning to be here. I'm not sure if I see her right now, but to negotiators in the room, that probably has consequences for how you negotiate the NCQG in the next week or so, and let's keep that in mind too. Thanks very much, Carolyn. Ambassador, I've been told that we need to wrap up. I'd love to give you just the final word here. Perhaps as we move on post this COP, in the context of what Carolyn has said, is it's not just about COP31. Do you have any encouragements for us in how we can be practically partnering with Pacific Islands around us and partnering with each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, one, I think it would be great for the Pacific if Australia hosted the COP. So let's go get them the COP. So that's the call to action, is let's go and lobby all these countries to try to see if we can get Pacific COP to come to Australia. I think that's one. I think the second is one of the things that people may or may not fail to recognize is Australia is the third largest oil and gas producing country in the world. And they signed the agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. That says volumes about the type of commitment and leadership that they can play. So I think that's one of the things that we have to encourage the Australian government to really say, if it comes to us, we're the third largest producer, and we can make a really outsized positive movement in the way the world approaches this transition away from fossil fuels. And finally, I think we, in addition to government, we have to engage with civil society, academia, the private sector, and really try to get everyone on board so that we can have a successful outcome for, this COP, Brazil, and then hopefully on to Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Carolyn. Folks, we've come to the end of our formal time together. I believe that there are cocktails and perhaps some nibbles available afterwards, so please do stay around, continue these conversations, be in touch with Minderoo if you're looking to partner, and thank you for coming.